Greetings, Mencken fans. My name is Jeff Jerome, and I'm so pleased to be here to introduce this next Mencken Minute. I'm a member of the board of the Society to Preserve H.L. Menckens Legacy. And I'm really excited about this one because many people ask about the garden. What's planted here? What's the history of the site? So today we have another member of the board, Miss Betsey Waters, who will give you everything you need to know about this wonderful garden. So without further ado, please enjoy this segment of Mencken's beloved garden, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Betsey Waters, and I'm a volunteer at the Mencken House Museum. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the garden and what's so special about the garden. The garden and the house are set for the period of circa 1940. Most of the structures in the garden were present at this time, and so that's why it makes the perfect time to set the garden at this stage. The pergola, the arbor, and the bricks on the wall were all things that were here in the 40s. Most of the plants that are planted in the garden were based on research that was done first by the City Life Museum. It was also made from notes in Mencken's books himself. And it's also partnered with the fact that we have to think about what plants are invasive in a small inner city garden like this. And so we tried to choose plants. There are obviously some plants that we had to have in the garden. His wisteria and the ivy. They are particularly invasive plants, and we're constantly keeping them cut. But they have to be in the garden because they're important to the garden, and they were important to Mencken. Some of the other plants that we've incorporated in here, peonies and lantana. These are plants that the peonies, we actually have a receipt from the Mencken family for when they purchased them. The snowball hydrangea was also purchased at the time, and the mahonia, which is in the back of the yard. These were all plants that we actually have documented receipts that they were purchased. So unfortunately, during the renovation, this area was used to stage a lot of the construction, and a lot of the plants were damaged. Some of them were indeed destroyed. So we have had to replant some of them. We did use notes and picked plants that we thought would, add to the garden many of the things that might not necessarily be part of the actual history are annuals and will die back every year. But some of the other plants that we chose, we saw references to Mencken's mother planting ferns in the garden. There was a Victorian period where they did a lot of wildlife plantings. So we incorporated ferns into the garden, and we chose Christmas ferns because they're an evergreen, and Mencken liked the evergreens in the garden. He liked to be able to look out and see green at all times of the garden. We have liriape, we have sweet fern, we have forsythia that we've planted, we have black-eyed Susans. We planted also petunias because there's a mention of him buying his petunias at the Hollands Market. We have iris, and in the early spring we have spiderwort, and these were all plants that at one point or another in his books have been mentioned. So the Menckens moved into this house in 1883. That's when the house was built. Mencken was 3 years old when they moved in. When they went about developing the garden in the back here, the garden was filled with construction debris. So there were pieces of brick and items all through the backyard. And so it didn't really make it suitable to be a garden. So his grandfather recommended that they scrape off the top layers of soil, and they hauled in several cartloads of good fertile topsoil. And that gave Anna a base to build her gardens. So initially, the garden housed vegetables. There were several fruit trees. There was a plum tree, cherry trees, a peach tree, and a pear tree. and they provided food and activity for the Mencken boys all summer long. There's a sample of the grapes here behind me. They still stand here in the yard. Mencken would recount on how often they got belly aches from all the fruit that they would eat, often way before it was ready to be eaten. So Mencken called the backyard a land of delight and enchantment. And I'd like to think that this is where he developed his sense of observation. He was also developed his photographic skills. He loved the chemistry of developing film, and so he took a lot of pictures out here in the backyard, mostly of his family, and then he would develop them himself. So it was a great place for him to develop that sense of observation. When he was 11 years old, the father got him a pony, and there was a pony shed here in the backyard. The pony was named Frank. Mencken called Frank a cheat, a rogue, and a scoundrel. And he was known for biting them and kicking them and sneezing in their faces and crowding them in the stalls and all kinds of mischief. He hated to be curried, and so as they would curry them, they had to be careful of their hindquarters because Frank would reach around and bite them in the seat of their pants, and so they had to be very carefully brush him while they pointed their rear ends away from him. And Henry received such a bite one time, he said he had a scar for life. So Frank was also very mischievous. He would get out of his stall, and he actually was the cause of the demise of the peach tree. He got out one time and he ate the bark of the peach tree from the top all the way to the ground. Mencken said his mother cried when the peach tree died. Frank also had a great love of ice cream, and he would know in the kitchen when they were making ice cream because he would he would smell it, and he would kick up in the stalls and he would whinny until they would bring him out some. And one time they spoiled a batch by letting too much salt get into it. They brought the whole thing out to him and he ate the whole thing. So Frank was definitely a character. The productiveness of the vegetable garden kind of waned after a while. The encroachment of buildings from the neighborhood created too much shade. The trees created too much shade. And the vegetable garden was, they were not able to sustain the vegetable garden. The neighbors built a cigar factory next door, a two-story building, which contributed to the amount of shade. Also, starting in 1892, the Mencken started leaving the city for the summer. And so the garden wasn't really maintained during the summer, and so it pretty much was allowed to go. I think that's when the mother started planting petunias and things that would grow even if it wasn't watered. During the middle of Mencken's life, the years maybe 1911 to 1928, he had the time to make the garden his own. He had the time to put in the things that he wanted to do. He built the brick wall, which his mother had always wanted. He built the pergola, the arbor, the hydrant, the sundial. He added features to the walls like the Moravian tiles, which were made at the Moravian Pottery and Tile Works in Doylesville, Pennsylvania. He had the memorial to Tessie built. He had the fountain made for his niece Virginia. He had the death mask of Beethoven and the first few notes of the Fifth Symphony put onto the wall, as well as a whimsical equation created by August Mencken, who was an engineer. So these were all things that were added to the house that gives this garden a particular feeling of Mencken. During this time, he also had turtles in the backyard. And initially, he had two turtles. These were box turtles, Terrapin Carolina. They were named originally Captain Sawyer and Josephus Daniels, until they found out that Captain Sawyer was laying eggs in the garden, and so she became Mary Baker Eddy. And so they had those turtles in the backyard for several years, continuing to lay eggs and having more turtles. Eventually, Gertrude took them out with her to the country, and they were set free out in the country. At a later period, around 1936, Mencken got 3 more turtles that he kept here in the backyard. These turtles eventually became tame, and they would often show up at the kitchen door looking for breakfast in the morning. Their favorite were buckwheat cakes smeared with molasses. In Mencken's later years, the garden was more difficult for him to maintain, particularly after his strokes. But he preferred, or he enjoyed, looking out the back door and seeing the evergreen nature of the ivy and the myrtle that his mother had planted years ago. And that was enough to sustain him. He would, even in wintertime, he could look out the back door and see a perpetual green covering over the whole garden. He would come out here in the evenings because it would be cool. And this was a source of peace and refuge for him, this little enclosed space. It was soft, the green was soft on his eyes, and it wasn't harsh for him. And so he continued to find pleasure in the garden, particularly around the structures that he had built in his middle years. Mencken died in 1956, and after he died, his brother August attempted to preserve the home by having it made or designated as a National Historic Landmark. In an oral history that August did in 1958, he stated he wanted to preserve the house, and more especially the yard, because my brother was more attached to the yard and the garden than he ever was to the house. And so, in that vein, we try to continue the garden as we think Mencken would have liked to have had it. We pay attention to the details, to the planning, because we too find it to be a source of refuge and peace. In the middle of the city, it is a very quiet, peaceful spot. And so we are very happy that we can maintain this for Mencken and his legacy. Thank you.